Caltheria was a land of stone and sky, its people proud and independent, its mountains veined with silver and its rivers coursing like veins of life. But for all its natural wealth, the kingdom's heart rested in something far older, far simpler: the ancient law. For 1,000 years or more, when a king passed without a direct heir, Caltheria's crown was not bestowed by bloodlines, nor by clerics or councils. It was earned in combat. Not a war of armies nor a slaughter of hundreds, just a duel, simple and sacred. 2 contenders in a stone ring atop the highest peak, a wooden spear in each hand. No armor, no sword. The victor would rise from the ring as king, their worth, proven by strength and cunning. This law was a relic from Caltheria's earliest days, when the first settlers carved their homes into the cliffs and fought off the beasts of the wilderness. Back then, the leader was simply the strongest among them, chosen not by the accident of birth but by trial. Over time, the law hardened into tradition, then into a fundamental tenet of the kingdom's governance. When a ruler died childless, the law ensured a worthy successor. The ring atop the council's peak became a hallowed place steeped in history. Generations had watched as warriors, hunters, and even shepherds stood their ground, facing one another under the wide sky with nothing but wooden spears and the weight of the kingdom on their shoulders. This time was no different. The line of King Revolt had ended with his sudden passing, leaving no direct heir. The Council of Elders invoked the ancient law. The proclamation echoed through every mountain valley, every village square. A new king would be chosen, and all were free to contend. For some, this was a chance for glory. For others, a chance to prove that courage and skill could surpass noble blood. Across the kingdom, the bold and the desperate took up spears, climbed rugged trails, and began their pilgrimage to the council's peak. It was said that in every generation the ring would draw out the one most fit to lead, not by privilege, but by deed. Among those who answered the call was a young forester named Jaren. He had no noble heritage, no wealth to speak of. He was a commoner, used to living off the land, his hands rough from chopping wood and snaring game. His strength was not in his size. He was lean, not muscular, nor in his fame, for he was known only to the villagers who bought his firewood and furs. His strength lay in his quickness and his sharp mind. He could outmaneuver a deer on a narrow path, read the signs of an approaching storm in the wind's shift, and memorize the terrain of a forest after one journey through it. He had never held a sword, nor worn armor, but he knew how to fight. His father had taught him to defend himself with whatever was at hand: a branch, a stone, even the haft of his axe. So when Jaren heard the proclamation, he thought not of the throne, but of the test. He thought of the ancient stories, of those who rose from nothing to lead the kingdom. He thought of the opportunity not to become king but to prove himself. In his heart he did not see himself seated upon a golden throne. He saw himself standing in the ring, facing an opponent and winning. With little more than a borrowed spear, Jaren left his quiet valley and climbed the long path toward the council's peak. Along the way, he encountered others with the same destination in mind. There were knights clad in faded tunics, their spears slung across their backs like old banners. There were hunters who carried the scars of their trade, blacksmiths whose hands gripped their weapons with unshakable confidence, and even farmers who looked more determined than skilled. Jaren did not speak much during the journey. He watched, listened, and learned. He noticed how some fighters held their spears too tightly, their knuckles white with tension. He observed how others moved, some fast, some deliberate, and how they sized one another up. Every encounter was a lesson, every step another preparation for the contest that awaited. When he reached the peak, he found the ring just as the stories described: a circle of stone, its surface worn smooth by generations of footsteps and battles. The view from the summit was breathtaking, the mountains stretching in every direction, the valleys far below wrapped in mist. It was as if the entire kingdom was watching, silent and expectant. The contenders gathered there, 12 in all, each chosen by their own will, each believing they had a chance. There was the battle-worn knight who once stood at King Revold's side. There was the blacksmith whose arms seemed thicker than Jaren's legs. There was the huntress with eyes as sharp as her reputation. And there was Jaren, an unknown forester with nothing but his wits and his borrowed spear. As the sun began to set, casting the ring in gold and shadow, the council's elders arrived. They were robed figures, ancient as the law itself, their faces weathered by years of judgment. They spoke few words, for none were needed. The law was clear, the tradition understood. They simply raised their hands to the ring, signaling that the contest would begin at dawn. Jaren gripped his spear, feeling the smooth wood under his fingers. He wasn't the strongest nor the most experienced. But he had come this far, and tomorrow he would step into that ring. The throne wasn't what mattered. What mattered was the fight, the law, and the chance to prove himself. The sun rose slowly, casting its golden light over the jagged peaks. A cold wind swept through the high valley where the council's peak rose, sending a shiver through those gathered for the contest. The ring of stone, hallowed ground, stood ready, 12 contenders, 12 spears, and the silent eyes of the council's elders watching. The rules were simple, but merciless. No killing, though that did not make the fights any less dangerous. Victory came when one's opponent was disarmed or forced to yield. Those who faltered were eliminated. There would be no second chances. By the end of the day, only the most cunning and determined would remain. The first pair stepped into the Yara ring at the crack of dawn. A burly trapper named Farron faced off against a traveling mercenary who had come all the way from the southern borders. Farron's size seemed an overwhelming advantage, and at first it was. He swung his spear in wide arcs, forcing the mercenary back. But the mercenary was quick and patient, dodging rather than blocking, making Farron waste energy. It wasn't long before Farron's heavy swings grew sluggish. In a single sharp movement, the mercenary struck Farron's hand, knocking his spear free. Farron, stunned, stumbled out of the ring without a word. The mercenary stood silently as the elders nodded their approval. It set the tone for the day. Brute strength alone would not win. Each match revealed a new style, a new approach to wielding the simple wooden spear. Some relied on aggression, charging their opponents and overwhelming them with flurries of strikes. Others stayed back, feinting, waiting for their opponent to make a mistake. When it was Jaren's turn, he stepped into the ring against a wiry youth named Lihan. The younger man had the speed and energy of inexperience, but Jaren could see it in his stance, his grip too tight, his movements too eager. The moment the match began, Lihan lunged, aiming to end it quickly. Jaren didn't retreat. Instead, he sidestepped, letting Lihan's thrust glance harmlessly past him. The youth stumbled, and Jaren took advantage of the moment, pivoting and sweeping his spear in a calculated arc. It struck the shaft of Lihan's weapon hard enough to loosen the boy's grip. Lihan froze for an instant, and Jaren closed the distance, giving a quick twist of his spear. Lihan's weapon clattered to the ground. The elders declared Jaren the victor. He stepped out of the ring, his pulse racing, his grip on the spear still firm. The contest had barely begun, but the tension already weighed heavily. Jaren knew he had won not through force but through observation and timing. It wasn't strength that had carried him, it was awareness. As the day went on, the ring saw increasingly fierce battles. The knight, with his precise movements, easily disarmed a berry farmer who tried to charge him. The blacksmith, towering and broad, shattered his opponent's spear with a single mighty blow, his sheer power enough to end the fight before it truly began. The huntress faced an experienced soldier, but her fluid movements and quick strikes kept him on the defensive until she finally slipped her spear under his guard and knocked it from his hands. Each victory added to the weight of expectation. The contenders who remained were the ones who adapted, who saw openings, who turned the simplicity of the wooden spear into something greater. And yet, the ring was not kind to those who overestimated themselves. A well-known bounty hunter, confident in his years of tracking and combat, charged an older contender and found himself outmaneuvered. His own spear spun from his grasp as he tripped over uneven ground. The older man, though gray-haired and slight, moved with the precision of someone who had survived countless fights. In the ring, experience could outweigh brute strength. By the time the sun hung low in the sky, more than half the contenders were gone. Jaren watched each match intently, noting patterns and flaws. He saw how the knight's form never wavered, how the blacksmith's raw power compensated for his slower footwork, how the huntress anticipated her opponent's moves before they made them. And Jaren knew that when his next match came, he would need every bit of the insight he had gained. As dusk fell, the elders called an end to the day's matches. The remaining contenders gathered around a fire, their eyes guarded, their bodies weary. The blacksmith and the knight sharpened their spears against stones while the huntress sat silently, gazing into the flames. Jaren took a seat on a rock, his fingers still curled around his spear's smooth wooden shaft. He replayed the day's battles in his mind, searching for weaknesses he could exploit. He didn't have the knight's discipline, the blacksmith's raw strength, or the huntress's deadly accuracy, but he had his eyes, his instincts, and his understanding of the rhythm of combat. If that was enough to survive the first day, it might just be enough to face whatever came. The second morning broke colder than the first, frost silvering the stones at the council's peak. A gust of wind rattled through the gathered contenders as the elders resumed their silent vigil. The pool of hopefuls had thinned considerably. Those who remained were hardened and wary, knowing the coming matches would be far more dangerous than the ones before. Jaren stood with the others, his spear held loose in his hand, his eyes scanning the faces around him. The knight Sir Aldrin was still the image of composure, his movements efficient and practiced as he warmed up with small thrusts and parries. The blacksmith, Donal, looked as if he were carved from the mountains themselves, his muscles coiled, like ropes of iron. The huntress, Taria, sat slightly apart from the group, her sharp eyes flicking between her opponents. Her presence was quiet, almost subdued, yet there was a stillness about her that suggested careful calculation. It was clear to everyone that she wasn't just biding her time, she was plotting her next move. The first match of the day pitted Donal against a veteran soldier. The blacksmith wasted no time. He drove forward with his immense strength, each strike of his spear forcing the soldier back step by step. Within minutes, Donal had broken through the soldier's defenses, sending his opponent's weapon clattering to the ground. It was a show of sheer dominance, one that left the other contenders exchanging uneasy glances. Few of them would have the strength to stop Donal if it came down to a direct confrontation. Taria, however, seemed unperturbed. When her turn came, she faced a younger man, nimble and energetic but reckless. Taria didn't chase him around the ring. She let him attack first, studying his movements. Every thrust he made was a signal, a story that she read in an instant. When she finally countered, it was with precision so exact it seemed inevitable. She feinted to his left, drew him into overextending, and struck his spear just hard enough to knock it from his grip. It wasn't a display of strength. It was the careful unraveling of an opponent's strategy. Jaren watched her fight closely, his mind racing. She was different from Donal or Sir Aldrin. She didn't rely on power or rigid technique. Instead, She drew her opponents in, baiting them into mistakes they couldn't recover from. If he was to face her, he knew he couldn't play her game. He would need to find a way to turn her cleverness against her. His own match came later in the morning. This time he faced a shepherd who had survived the first day with surprising tenacity. The man fought with brute determination, each swing of his spear heavy and deliberate. Jaren, however, kept his calm. He saw the shepherd's strikes coming, a split second before they landed. He moved lightly, sidestepping when needed, countering when the opportunity arose. In a moment of weakness, the shepherd overcommitted. Jaren parried, stepped inside his opponent's guard, and twisted his spear sharply against the shepherd's. The weapon flew from the man's hands, and the match was over. Jaren walked out of the ring, breathing heavily, but triumphant. By midday, only 5 contenders remained. The elders announced the next matches, and the air around the ring grew tense. The blacksmith would face the knight, a clash of raw strength against honed discipline. Jaren's match would be against Taria. His heart sank as he realized he would have to find a way past her. The thought of her calm, precise movements haunted him. He had seen her dismantle more experienced opponents without breaking a sweat. As he sat by the fire, chewing on a strip of dried meat, he replayed her earlier matches in his head. She wasn't just quick, she was patient, methodical. She let others make the first move, then turned their aggression into her victory. If he was going to win, he couldn't let her control the pace. When their match was called, Jaren stepped into the ring, his mind focused but his heart racing. Taria stood opposite him, her spear held loosely in one hand. The wind swept through her dark hair, and for a moment she looked at him not with disdain, but with interest. She nodded slightly, as if to say, "Show me what you've got." The fight began slowly, both of them circling. Jaren could feel the crowd's anticipation as he shifted his weight from foot to foot. He waited for Taria to strike first, but she didn't. She just watched, waiting for him to falter. Jaren hesitated, then lunged forward, not with a wild attack but with a probing strike designed to test her reaction. Taria dodged smoothly, countering with a quick jab that Jaren only barely avoided. The rhythm was set. He would advance, she would retreat, and then she would counter. It was her gambit, her way of drawing him out. But Jaren had studied her too closely to fall into the trap. Instead of continuing to press her, he broke the pattern. On her next counter, he stepped into her strike rather than away from it. It was a risky move, but it caught her off guard. Taria's spear missed by inches, and in that moment of imbalance, Jaren surged forward. With a twist of his spear, he hooked hers and wrenched it from her grasp. The wood clattered against the stones and Taria froze. The crowd erupted in murmurs as Jaren lowered his spear, his breath coming fast. Taria looked at him, then smiled faintly. She nodded again, a silent acknowledgement of his skill before, stepping out of the ring, the elders declared Jaren the victor. He stood in the center of the ring, dazed by what he had accomplished. He had beaten the huntress not with strength, but by turning her strategy against her. It wasn't luck. It was the result of careful observation, of adapting to an opponent's movements. As he stepped down from the ring, he realized that his hardest challenge had just been conquered. But the day was far from over. Donal and Sir Aldrin would clash next, a titanic struggle that would leave only one standing. The fourth day began with a hushed anticipation. Only 3 contenders remained. Sir Aldrin, the knight whose unshakable form and discipline had carried him through every duel. Donal, the blacksmith whose sheer power had shattered both spears and spirits. And Jaren, the quiet forester who had outlasted stronger opponents with a blend of cunning and instinct. The contest was nearing its end, and the kingdom watched with bated breath, waiting to see who would step forward as its next ruler. The ring atop the council's peak had grown more solemn, the air heavy with expectation. The elders conferred, briefly before announcing the day's first match, Donal versus Jaren. Sir Aldrin, the last uncontested challenger, would face the winner. Jaren's heart tightened. Facing the blacksmith was a daunting prospect. Donal's strength was unmatched. He had swept aside opponents with raw force, his strikes so powerful that his victories seemed inevitable. Jaren took his place in the ring, his wooden spear feeling fragile in his hands. Donal entered opposite him, his broad shoulders seeming to fill the space. He gave Jaren a nod, but it wasn't a gesture of camaraderie. It was a silent acknowledgement of the Forester's earlier victories, a sign that Donal didn't see him as an unworthy foe. Even so, Jaren knew that the blacksmith's respect didn't make him any less dangerous. The elders raised their hands, and the match began. Donal came forward immediately, his spear sweeping in a heavy arc that forced Jaren to leap back. The blow had enough force to send a gust of air past his face, and he knew that if he tried to block it head-on, his spear would snap. Donal followed with a quick second strike, not giving Jaren a moment to regroup. His attacks were relentless, each swing a demonstration of his superior strength. It was all Jaren could do to keep his distance, ducking and sidestepping to avoid the worst of the onslaught. The blacksmith pressed harder, his strikes growing bolder, aiming to corner Jaren against the ring's edge. Jaren's heart pounded. He couldn't match Donal's strength, and he didn't have time to think about precision counterattacks. Instead, he relied on movement. He danced around the ring, using the uneven terrain to his advantage. Donal's heavy steps were steady, but slower, his power built for quick finishes, not extended chases. Jaren's strategy became clear: tire him out. He couldn't overpower Donal, but he could outlast him. With each sidestep and dodge, he forced the blacksmith to overextend, to take an extra step, to swing a little harder than he intended. The exertion began to show. Donal's breaths came faster, his strikes no longer as swift. Jaren saw the opening he'd been waiting for. On the next swing, Donal overreached, his spear cutting wide as he tried to corner Jaren. Instead of retreating, Jaren stepped into the attack, driving his own spear upward. It wasn't a forceful blow. He didn't need to overpower Donal. He just needed to disrupt his rhythm. The sharp contact threw the blacksmith's spear slightly off balance, enough for Jaren to pivot to the side and press forward. He struck. Again, aiming not at Donal himself but at the shaft of his weapon. The strike landed just below Donal's grip, causing him to falter. For the first time, Donal's stance broke. He tried to recover, but his massive swings, so unstoppable at first, were now slower and easier to read. Jaren moved swiftly, targeting the weak points. He struck Donal's spear near the base, twisting his own weapon to apply maximum leverage. The blacksmith growled, his strength surging in an attempt to regain control. But Jaren shifted once more, striking hard at Donal's hands. The spear dropped. It clattered onto the stone floor of the ring, its sound echoing in the silent air. Donal stood still, his chest heaving, his face a mixture of frustration and begrudging respect. He looked at Jaren, then gave a single nod before stepping out of the ring. Jaren felt his knees threaten to give way, but he stood tall. The elders conferred for a moment before announcing his victory. The crowd, once tense and quiet, murmured in astonishment. Few had expected the wiry Forester to survive against the blacksmith, let alone win. Yet Jaren had done it, not by matching strength, but by turning Donal's might against him, wearing him down and striking when it mattered most. But there was no time to celebrate. The final match awaited. Sir Aldrin, the knight who had been the epitome of form and control throughout the contest, would be his last opponent. Jaren knew this would be his greatest test yet. Donal's power had been overwhelming, but Aldrin's precision would be no less deadly. As the sun set and the day drew to a close, Jaren sat by the fire, his spear resting across his lap. His hands were raw, his arms sore from the constant strain. But his mind was focused. He had seen Aldrin fight, watched every duel the knight had won. He knew that Aldrin's strength wasn't in brute force or wild aggression. It was in balance, in timing, in the ability to read an opponent and respond before the attack even came. Jaren didn't know if he had the skill to match Aldrin, but he had learned something important in every fight so far. He had learned to observe, to adapt, to see not just the strikes, but the thoughts behind them. As he stared into the flames, he told himself that this final challenge wasn't just a fight, it was a culmination. Everything he had seen, every movement he had studied, every risk he had taken had brought him to this point. The crown was within reach, but it would take all his wits and willpower to claim it. Morning came shrouded in mist, and the air seemed heavier than usual. For the first time, the ring at the summit of the council's peak was completely silent. The small crowd that had gathered to witness the contest stood back, their murmurs subdued. Only two men remained, Sir Aldrin, the knight whose reputation preceded him, and Jaren, the unlikely forester who had outlasted and outwitted every other challenger. The final match was upon them. Jaren stepped into the ring, his legs aching from days of combat, his hands calloused from the endless grip of his wooden spear. Across from him, Sir Aldrin stood tall and composed, his tunic fluttering in the light breeze, his spear held with the kind of practiced ease that came from a lifetime of training. For all the sweat and exhaustion that had marked the competition, Aldrin looked as though he'd only just begun. His movements were measured, his face unreadable. The elders raised their hands, signaling the start. Neither man moved right away. They stood at the edges of the ring, their eyes locked, their postures steady. Jaren knew he couldn't afford the first mistake. Aldrin would punish any opening without hesitation. Jaren had spent the previous night replaying every match he'd witnessed, every move Aldrin had made. The knight wasn't just skilled, he was patient. He never struck first unless it served a purpose, and he rarely left his guard open. Jaren needed to find a way to disrupt that balance. Aldrin was the first to shift his stance. A small step forward, his spear angling slightly. Jaren responded in kind, matching the step and keeping his spear pointed toward the knight's chest. Their movements mirrored one another, each probing for a weakness that didn't yet exist. For several long moments the crowd barely breathed. Then Aldrin struck. Not with a wild attack, but with a smooth, direct thrust. Jaren twisted to the side, the spear's tip grazing his shoulder. He countered quickly, swinging his weapon in. A wide arc meant to force Aldrin back, but the knight anticipated the move. Aldrin's spear came up, blocking Jaren's attack cleanly, and he pushed forward, his strikes now coming in a rapid sequence. Jaren had to give ground. The knight's precision was relentless. Every move seemed calculated, every step forward forcing Jaren closer to the ring's edge. Jaren's heart pounded as he narrowly avoided another thrust. He knew he couldn't keep this up. Aldrin's control of the fight was absolute. But Jaren also knew the knight's greatest strength was his reliance on form and predictability. If Jaren could find a way to disrupt that rhythm, to force Aldrin into unfamiliar territory, he might have a chance. He changed tactics. Instead of retreating, Jaren began sidestepping, moving in tighter circles rather than backing away. He kept his strikes quick, almost careless looking. Aldrin adjusted, his spear flowing to meet every attack, but the shift in movement gave Jaren a tiny sliver of control. Aldrin's feet began to reposition more frequently, his smooth movements slightly more strained. It wasn't much, but it was something. Jaren saw his opportunity. He lunged forward with what seemed like an overly ambitious strike. Aldrin reacted immediately, deflecting the attack and stepping in to counter. But Jaren was ready. He feinted, at the last second, pulling his spear back and twisting sharply to Aldrin's left. The sudden change in direction threw the knight off balance for a split second. Enough time for Jaren to plant the base of his spear against Aldrin's weapon and push. It wasn't a hard strike, but it was well placed. Aldrin stumbled, his footing uneven on the slick stone. He managed to recover quickly, but in that brief moment, Jaren had already moved. He was now in the center of the ring, controlling the space. Aldrin turned to face him, his expression still calm. But there was a flicker of something new in his eyes. Caution. Jaren pressed his advantage. He didn't let Aldrin settle back into his rhythm. He kept moving, feinting, striking from odd angles. The attacks weren't strong enough to disarm the knight outright, but they kept him off balance. Aldrin's responses, once fluid and exact, became less certain. He began shifting his stance more frequently, adjusting his grip, his steps a fraction of a second slower. Then came the decisive moment. Aldrin attempted a quick series of thrusts, hoping to regain the initiative. Jaren dodged the first and parried the second, but he didn't back away. Instead, he closed the gap, using his smaller size to move inside Aldrin's reach. It was a gamble. If Aldrin recovered too quickly, Jaren would have no room to retreat. But Aldrin hesitated, just for a heartbeat, caught off guard by the sudden proximity. Jaren struck downward, hooking his spear against Aldrin's and twisting with all the strength he had left. Aldrin's spear flew from his hands. The knight froze, staring at the empty space where his weapon had been. Jaren stepped back, his chest heaving, his own spear still held steady. The crowd erupted in gasps and murmurs. Aldrin looked at Jaren, then slowly knelt to retrieve his weapon. But instead of re-engaging, he straightened, tapped the butt of his spear to the ground, and gave a small, respectful bow. The elders stepped forward, their voices carrying over the hushed onlookers. By ancient law, the one who wins becomes king. The ring has spoken. They turned toward Jaren. You have proven yourself. The throne is yours. Jaren stood in the center of the ring, barely able to believe what he had just accomplished. His hands shook as he lowered his spear. The weight of the crown loomed before him, not as a reward, but as a responsibility. He had fought, not for riches nor for glory, but to prove that someone like him, someone without noble blood, without wealth or fame, could stand in the ring and prevail. Now, he had won. As he looked out over the misty peaks, he realized the true test was only just